it's the 40 to 65%.
I was wondering something had happened. Yeah, I can understand that could be. Okay, how do we get that? Okay, I was trying to figure it out.
And he said, so when he talked about herd immunity, you know, the big well, he said it's already happened and happened, and that was one of the reasons it was so what's right is when you got the flu, stay home.
Right.
So many, and when you take that number of people that are going to have it, and you take the there's something wrong with the percentage of those people that have been hurt badly.
I see what you're saying, man.
Are a much lower percentage because they either count the people that went in, got checked, and were identified as that.
Right. Now, makes sense.
We never did that with flu or anything else. You just didn't feel good. You didn't know whether you had flu or back cold or that stuff.
Right. Okay. There we go.
Ate some bad food and had to, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to get on my phone.
Put your head. This thing's caught in the bag. Yeah.
So I'm gonna try. I can't walk out because I love you too much, baby. I was on the song on the radio this morning. What was it? I'm caught in a trap. I can't walk back because I love you too much, baby.
Thank you, Ellie.
I can't just see what you're doing.
Step up here.
I saw that 40 times. Number 76? Yeah.
Good job.
You know, he kept forgetting the words to the song.
Oh, that's a shame.
I saw Elton when he was here. Years ago. Yeah, it'll be 3 years this summer.
All right.
Well, did you get to see it?
Oh my gosh.
Oh my goodness. Right. Hi everyone. I might have to pull out my phone for a minute to start the meeting. You might have a little bit of. Hi everyone. I don't know when you want to start. We have.
Walter, Debbie,
Is Debbie on?
Yeah. Are you ready, Chaz?
I am.
And you got the PowerPoint set up and everything?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you should.
Chaz can show the PowerPoint. What it is that my camera isn't working on the laptop. So I made him the host. So that's the benefit of everybody can see it. From Chaz's, yeah, correct. And I think all that will happen is Chaz is just when Kelley wants to do next slide, he'll say next slide. This is kind of common, Kelley. We've got a couple that come here and then 6 or 7 that are on Zoom.
I know churches, like,
Yeah, 7:00. I mean, yeah, we tend to start at, we've been starting at 7:05. William.
Maybe it's great that.
Is it kind of strong? All right, do you want to get?
Yeah.
All right, do you want to get?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Those here present in spirit, person, if you would, please join me in reciting pledge allegiance to the
Flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this new day and we thank you for all the many blessings that we have. We thank you for this great country, for our hope that we can get everything all pulled back together. We also want to thank you for Rotary and ask that you help us continue all the good works that we do in this world.
Amen.
Thank you. All right, we're thankful to get our speaker. Actually, I can respond.
Okay, why?
Pause.
All right. It's crazy. I think he would be.
what did I do?
I don't think you. Okay, I think what you're gonna do is.
There we go. Now it's the other way around. Upside down.
I'm just gonna have to do it like that. What's going on?
What do you?
You all right? You're pointing it to me. I'm probably gonna do it upside. All right. Great.
There you go.
Okay. Right here. Just hold it towards us.
You already all Harris government.
Oh, I am. That's right.
Isn't that easy?
It went through.
All right.
Okay. I think one of my recent donations was supposed to put me over the hump. So
All right.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, President Bush. Thank you.
For those of you all Harris. All Harris.
Yeah, I think it's 2:30. All right.
Little housekeeping.
We have an advantage.
Yeah, it's down there, guys.
You went there.
I read the email.
Where is it? No, that's
There's a little echo. Sorry. Okay. I'll do a brief introduction, everybody. On my power, you might have some echo. Unfortunately, the PowerPoint where I have my laptop is not enabling the video, so I'm using my phone, and we'll try to videotape some of that. But it's today's speaker is Kelley Coures. Kelley Coures is the Executive Director of the City of Evansville Department of Metropolitan Development. He's been in that position 6.5 years, but he's worked in the department the entire Winnicky administration since Winnicky took office. He's been a long friend of Mayor Winnicke's and Carol McClintock's. Very involved in Republican Party politics locally, and had a long career with American General, right? 31 years and retired from American General. And okay, 30, yeah, and 30 Rwanda. So after he did American General and retired, he ended up working for the Winnicke administration. And then is also a Kiwanian. We won't hold that against him, of course. So thanks to Chaz for facilitating the PowerPoint, but let me introduce to you Kelley Coures, our speaker. I'm going to try, I mean, it's a little bit of, I'm trying to capture your, but once it gets to be on a Chaz's PowerPoint, then we should be all right. Okay, so probably not. Yes, we are. Yeah, waiting for Chaz.
So just as a way of introduction, a lot of my jobs were preservation, use of federal funds. Person's history, celebration, economics, that we focus on history. And I've been a student of Black history
The slide deck
almost my
is up.
entire life, because one of my professors in college was Gerald Bickerman, who wrote the book, Local Black Stories. And he's the one that's my you know, I recognized that both Rotary and Kiwanis were segregated. Blacks couldn't join either club for many years, or women,
Right.
for example. So I've always felt a little bit of accountability and guilt for that. And in fact, I refused to join Kiwanis. My stepfather was Kiwanis from 1937 on till he died. But I refused to join until they let women. So I didn't join Kiwanis until everyone was welcome.
Okay. You have the PowerPoint up, Chaz?
Yes, the PowerPoint is up.
Okay. We don't. You need to share, yeah, you'll share the screen, but then, yeah, he needs to have the screen. I made him the host. I was here at 39. Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, that's all right.
It's my jam.
When we're ready to move on. So visually, you see maps here, in the other city plan, which outlines the school boards in 1925. Indiana had that was 1977. And the Black High School here was Frederick Douglass. Where we actually jumped from the school board was trying to figure out where to segregate Black high school. And this area was labeled of Evansville. So the high school was built there Lincoln Avenue. But it was Lincoln McCormick in those days, Lincoln McCormick. But that was the oh wow.
Sorry, that was,
Okay,
go ahead.
so Lincoln
I was muting
the 1962, but finally in 1949, the legislature overturned its 1877 law and said that Black children could go to whatever school is nearest their home. That they weren't forced to go to all segregated schools. So the school board renewed that. This was from 1950. And the school board was trying to figure out which schools would cater to the Black population. So you can see the areas of Black settlement that spread from this one small area here to what we know now, we call it Town, the little pocket of Black settlement called Blankenburg. There were a lot of coal mines up here in the 19th or 20th century, where a lot of Black men worked in coal mines. And then this little block right here is right where we're sitting in a neighborhood called High Street. And if you're my age, 62 and older, you remember hearing your parents talk about High Street. High Street was the city's red light district, but it also had a very high percentage of African American population. And then the area right here had spread by 1950 to a lot of the environments down here. And this neighborhood down here was called Avondale. We know it now as Lynn. So those were the principal areas of Black settlement. This Black settlement in their city, so there's a whole school of education thought about why African Americans settled where they did. Most of it was because of redlining and the desire to be near family. Primary cause. But it's after the study that we did in 2017 of religions in Evansville. When you see this black outline of red squares, so it has 41 census tracts. The census tracts have areas of equal population. And so everyone, these 10 census tracts right here contain almost 58% of the African American population of Evansville. If you throw this census tract here into the mix, almost 70% of the African American population. The west side, west of Pigeon Creek, census tracts over here, out of a population of around 16,000. As far as the ACS census estimate in 2017, there were only 400 African American households out of 15,000. And if you go north of 9 here, out of a population of about 21,000, you only have around 700 African Americans. In Evansville, it's just very segregated. So the question is, how did this happen? So if we go to the next slide, you have to kind of start at the beginning. You have to start at the very beginning of Indiana. So when Indiana was carved out of the Northwest Territory, if you remember your American history, and the Northwest Territory was divided in 1787 into 5 separate territories. And the Indiana Territory was settled in the early 1800s. There were 2 Indiana territorial governors. One of whom actually became president in 1840. William Henry Harrison and Arthur St. Clair were the 2 earliest Indiana territorial governors, and both of them petitioned the U.S. Congress to admit Indiana as a slave state. So we've always learned that Indiana was a free state. Anything north of the Ohio River, everything south of the Ohio River was slave territory. But that's not entirely true, because the Northwest Territory, when that treaty was signed, there was a gray area about people who owned slaves in north of the Ohio River. And what the treaty did is it didn't rob those people of their property. So if you owned slaves and you lived in southern Indiana, you still owned them until they would die. And you also owned their offspring. So that situation lasted until 1820. So this gentleman is Henry Vanderberg. He's the person that our state or our county state for. He was a territorial judge during the days of the territory. He didn't live long enough to see any states. So Henry Vanderberg owned a large farm, and he owned quite a few slaves. And one of the interesting stories about Henry Vanderberg, he owned a man and his wife. Two ran away in 1800, and they ran to Vincennes in Knox County. And the Knox County judge, when they sued for their freedom, and the Knox County judge agreed with them and said, yes, under the Territorial Act of 1787 should be nasty. Well, Henry Vanderberg disagreed with that and sent agents to Vincennes to capture them, so he literally kidnapped them and brought them back to southern Indiana. But he died in 1812, and as a primary source where we know slavery still existed, this is an ad from what was the Evansville Dept, was the Evansville newspaper of the day, which offered some of the two of the people that he owned in February 1817. So 1820, slavery was finally outlawed, but what was still in the law was servitude. So what a lot of slave owners did is they had their own person sign 99-year indentures, which kept them in the servitude for 99 years. And those indentures that could be sold. So you could sell the indenture that person with you. If the former slave said they didn't want to sign that indenture, generally what happened is they would take them on a flatboat across the river in Kentucky, which was still a slave state. And just so we understand, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 did not free all of the slaves in the United States. And why is that? You know,
It was the freed slaves in the states that were still in rebellion.
in a state of rebellion. Kentucky was never in a state of rebellion. So slaves owned in Kentucky were not freed until December 31st, 1865. So in 1830, then finally the state overturned the indentured servitude law, and all of that became legal. But it's kind of late in the day. It was in 1830. So in 1851, India became a state in 1816. The first constitution was signed in 1816. 1851, Indiana had progressed far enough that the legislature decided it needed a new constitution. And one of the problems that Indiana Southern was having was an influx of Black people escaping slavery from the south over the Ohio River. So in order to deal with that, the legislature, in its new constitution, wrote Article 13, which dealt with free Blacks. And Article 13 was so important that it was voted on in a separate vote. The main constitution was on one ballot, and Article 13 was on another. It forbade the sale of property to a Black person. Education of Black children was forbidden. You couldn't do anything economically with a Black person. You couldn't do anything to exploit Black people. And it was Vanderburgh County, the vote to approve Article 13 was one of the highest percentages in the state, 87% voted to Article 13. Let's go to the next slide. I got to speed things up. This is Joseph Wright, and he was a governor in the 1850s, and he was elected to the Senate in 1860. And Joseph Wright, he was in the legislature starting in 1852. So we think of abolitionists. Abolitionists wanted to and wanted to basically go to war to end slavery. Abolitionists did everything they could, but it wasn't because abolitionists wanted Black people to be their neighbors. Abolitionists in the state of Indiana wanted slavery in the world, but abolitionists wanted to send the newly freed Black people to Africa. The 1972 appropriated money towards and offered $50 gold for any free black slave that wanted to go back, wanted to go to Liberia, settle in Liberia. Very, very few. Well, I mean, we were centuries away from the main black population being forced here to that. The generation, many generations before those. That was the priority was forced evacuation. So in 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Indiana legislature finally realized this was not going to this was a failure. So in 1863, they finally recognized colonization was not going to happen in this program. But Bright made a speech on the Senate floor in 1862 when the Emancipation Proclamation, the whole problem of the Civil War, the North was going to win the Civil War, I think we do that. And he said, we intend to have in Indiana a white population, not to have our jails and penitentiaries crowded with free blacks. He wanted black people to move on. This is not settle here. So let's go to the next slide. So by after the Civil War, there we go. But there we go. All right.
Yep.
There. Yeah. So by after the Civil War, Indiana's black population zoomed, and Evansville, our black population went up about 500 to 600% between 1860 and 1870. So by the 1880 census, about 10% of Evansville's population was African American, primarily settled on land. If you know your history, you know that the Wabash Canal came through Evansville, and there was a section that became Canal Street. That part of the old canal went bankrupt in the 1850s. Well, that canal just became a dump. That's where Evansville started to crash. And so there were two men, Willard Carpenter and Arthur Rosencrantz, bought the land along the old canal, which no one else wanted. It was now bankrupt. And that became an area of black settlement, which later became Canal Street between Walnut and Lincoln Avenue. And remember that map I showed you in 1995? That's how that happened. But by the 1880s, the black population in the United States were being led by two different philosophies by national African American leaders. Booker T. Washington, the writer, teacher, professor, author, Booker T. Washington, his philosophy was that black people in the United States could not possibly compete with the white population for economic stability and upward mobility. And so the black population needed to slow itself down and seek equality through hard work, thrift, and trusting that white leaders would see their needs. But they needed to not actively pursue civil rights, equality right away. And the Frederick Douglass, who both Booker T. Washington Frederick Douglass came here in 1876 to wrote the case, of course not foreseeing what would happen. But Frederick Douglass was on the opposite side. Frederick Douglass said no, that because of the death of the white population owed to African Americans for slavery, for all the wrongs that happened, that they needed equality, equality now, and equal rights and all of that. So in Evansville, there were two black leaders that espoused both those philosophies. They were both physicians. S.S. Dupay was a physician. There were several black doctors here in the 19th century. S.S. Dupay was a follower of Booker T. Washington. He was a big powerhouse. Most African Americans until FDR were Republicans. The black vote was generally a Republican vote because of the party wing. And Dupay was very active in the local segregated Republican Party. He led the black Republicans here And this is George Washington Butler, who was born into slavery, was very educated, very learned, became a doctor, physician, got his in 7. But George Washington Butler followed, and it was dicey for a black person to follow the Democratic Party because the Democrats had been anti-black, very much so. But by the 1880s, 1890s in Evansville, there was a Democrat leader named Aiken Parks.
Sure.
And William Aiken was much more amenable to civil rights and to try and help the population. So George Washington Butler Tower was made, and George Washington Butler espoused that Frederick Douglass philosophy of activism and fighting for civil rights. So he followed the Democrat Party, and which I said was kind of dicey, got a lot of death threats. Politics here was rough and tumble in those old days. And he had to have a guard during election years. But Butler, you may know this, was that he was a good friend of John Boehner, who was elected to Congress. And John Boehner convinced President Woodrow Wilson to name him the very first African American ambassador. He became the U.S. minister to Liberia and served for 2 years. He caught malaria.
He's a local.
That's
great.
But he was the very first U.S. ambassador to a country. So
From here in Evansville. Yeah. That's really cool.
there's no plaque. So.
No.
Let's go to the next slide. So in the 1880s, Evansville had one lynching. Lynching was a way of establishing white supremacy and fostering terror in lives and keeping black people from really trying very hard to fight for the rights. Evansville had one lynching. Two young black men were accused of assaulting a white woman, stealing some of the jewelry and some money. And about 2 hours after they were put in jail, which was at the courthouse was the third name, where the dry cleaner is now, where I live. And next door was the jail. So about 200 people invaded the jail that afternoon and brought these two out, and they beat them to death on the sidewalk with clubs and whatever, and then hung them from a lamppost that stood there at 30 and then fired bullets into the body. It was horrific. That was the only reason that occurred. But that culture, and I tried to get it listed in Equal Justice, it was too early. The BJI, they only count lynchings from 1875 on, because that was when the era of what they call spectacle lynching started. Lynchings were in the early days, like the Evansville lynching was finished. That was a vengeful lynching, because the thought among white people was that the law was not going to take care of black people, that they would escape justice. So we need to take it on ourselves to kill these people. But after 1875, lynchings became spectacles for people to enjoy. Especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, in Omaha, Nebraska, there was a crowd,
right?
And they staged it so that professional photographers could take photographs of the body hanging there, and then sell them as postcards.
That's why you see a lot of lynchings with lots of people around. Yeah, it's the spectacle.
Anyway, the lynching culture surrounded us. Probably, I've given this talk several times. There were several spectacle lynchings around us. 1871, 1878, brutal lynching. But the one that stands out to me is Christmas Day, 1900. In Rockport, there was a barber was murdered on a street of Christmas Eve in an alley. And there were two black men that were accused of this murder. And when they were arrested, they implicated a third black man that was befriended with. And he was well known. Hustler Joe, but he was always looking for a deal. Guys players. But he worked for a hotel here in Rockport. The hotel owner tried to tell these people that, at the time of this murder, Joe was working. He couldn't have been there, but they arrested him anyway. So in Rockport, the mob on Christmas Day broke into the jail in Rockport, put a giant hole in the wall of the jail. They used a telephone pole to ram through this window for a big hole. And so they dragged the two out that were originally charged. And while they were lynching these two, Hustler Joe managed to climb out of the hole in the wall. And he ran back to the hotel where he worked. And so the hotel owner told him, he said, well, I can't murder you because you're accused of murder. But he called the sheriff, Rockport Sheriff's Office. And the sheriff said, well, we'll get him out of town. We'll take him out of town. So they put him on a wagon and took him to Boone. They called Evansville, but Evansville sheriff said, do not bring him here. We don't want him here. And so he went to Boone. Well, the mob of 500 or 600 people, when they found out that Hustler Joe had taken the Boone, guess what they did? They hit the road. And they gathered up people along the road. And by the time they got to Boonville, there were probably 800 or 900 people that busted into the jail in Boonville and killed Hustler Joe. And later, if they had a trial, they would have learned that Joe was at work when this murder occurred, so he was innocent. But what came of this is the reason that's why it's important. Governor Durbin, Winfield Durbin, got the legislature to approve a law that if any sheriff in the state of Indiana allowed a prisoner to be taken from the jail without a fine and be lynched, that sheriff forfeited his job. And so that actually happened. Rockport sheriff lost his job. When they had the inquest, the sheriff said that he couldn't identify anyone in the mob. But then later, the sheriff said the reason he didn't fight back was because all of his friends and political supporters were in the mob. So what was he was supposed to do? Shoot his friends and supporters. So the ruling, this lynching and all the rest of them all around us was death by persons unknown. There was never anybody brought to justice for any of the lynching. So let's go to the next slide. So in Evansville, remember, we had separate school systems for black and white. The problem with Booker T. Washington's philosophy about lifting yourself up and working hard to improve yourself, one of the problems in Evansville was in 1902, the school board, the black high school, Frederick Douglass, they purposefully cut the years it took to get a high school diploma from 4 to 3. And out of the black high school, they removed things like Latin, foreign languages, advanced mathematics, advanced English, because the school board said that black high school students didn't need all of those courses because their life's work will be domestic help, pod carriers, being a road crew member to fix streets. So they removed all those advanced courses in the black high school, purposely devolving black education. And that didn't change again until 1928. Also, that year, it became a policy of the school board to pay black teachers the prior year's white teachers' salary schedule. And that didn't change. No, it's not back forward. Let's go forward. There we go. So July 1903, July 4th, the worst racial violence that Evansville had until 1968 occurred. There was a white policeman by the name of Massey. The 4th of July, the city was, in the 19th century, Evansville had a tavern on every corner. Yes. Well, I mean, Kind of does now. But there was a tavern operated by a Republican politician by the name of Fred Ossenberg. And Fred Ossenberg's tavern was at 10th and Mulberry, about where the school bus yard is. So a guy named Lee Brown had been drinking rather heavily and walked out without paying his bartender. The bartender followed him out, and the two guys to a fight on the sidewalk, and Officer Massey was walking his feet, and he was very popular, this police officer. And when he tried to stop Lee Brown from leaving Painesville, Brown pulled out a pistol and shot him. And the two got into a gunfight. Massey was shot in the chest and the stomach, and Lee Brown was shot in the abdomen as well. But Officer Massey became that later that day, doctor at Weldon Walker Hospital. He became the first policeman killed in that day. And so by about 8 o'clock that night, there was a mob of 4,000 people or so on 4th Street between the old jail and Hillcrest that are still there. So the mayor at the time, Mayor Cobert, did two things. Mayor Cobert and the sheriff called the Indianapolis to Governor Durbin and said, send the National Guard. And they also decided to get Lee Brown, who they left his wounds untreated. They put him on a train. So there's a tunnel that runs under the old jail to the old courthouse. The tunnel's still there. I think it's closed up now. So they took Brown out and took him under there, took him out of the 5th Street basement doors, put him on a train, and took him to Vincennes, where he died about 30 days later from gangrene. But so the crowd, they had grown, and a lot of them were drunk. They pulled down a telephone pole. There's some famous pictures of the jail with the windows broken out. And so they broke in the jail, and they were going to lynch this guy. But when they found out he was gone, the mob started a riot. And they went to the black neighborhood and started setting houses on fire, breaking windows. People ran for their lives, fled. By the time the National Guard got here, there were probably 6,000 people downtown rioting because of this. And the National Guard set up in front of the jail, and it got really quiet apparently. And no one knows who fired first, but when the gunfire ended, there were 11 killed, and all of them were white. It was white people killing each other, basically, including a 11-year-old girl. So the result of this incident was the Evansville black population went from the 1900 census from about 15% of the population down to less than 10%. North, some went to Kentucky. The denouement of that July 1903, there was a black man that jumped on a train that was going west. He had relatives in Danville, Illinois. So he fled to Danville, and 2 weeks later, Danville had its worst race riot.
Wow.
And that guy got lynched on a street in Danville. He escaped Evansville, and he got lynched in Danville. Yeah. So by the turn of the century, the perpetuation of racial stereotypes against black people in the media of the day, which of course newspapers, was just awful. Black people, black men especially, were either shown to be black brutes, murderers, rapists, or there was this comedic, the minstrel show, the dancing, singing black person. It really was there was no in between where the media was concerned in those days. If you know, on downtown, 4th Street is wide between Main and Locust. 4th Street's really wide. Well, that was an open market in those. That's why it's so wide right now. But part of that was all black. The farthest point about where the Melbourne's parking lot was, that's all been torn down. But that was called the Midwest, and there were there was all of the people, this is white Evansville would read their newspaper in the morning and find out what happened on the Midway. Right? So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to teach you how to build a ghetto without zoning. Indianapolis passed the zoning ordinance, which prohibited black settlement outside of an area around Indiana County. And it was ruled unconstitutional. So Evansville never tried to do a racial zoning law because they realized it was illegal. So let's go to the next slide. So, okay, so the city election of 1905, I forgot the slide that's in here. Part of the political upheaval that was going on in the early 20th century, Democrats would blame the Republicans for bringing in black people from Kentucky and settling them here just so they could register to vote, so the Republicans would maintain political power. There really was no proof of that. Earlier in 1905, which is a rather violent election here, what the Negro colonization discovered, those headlines every day, there were stories about black people settling here just so they could vote. And the Republicans had maintained control of the city government for generations since William Aiken lost in 1897. So let's go to the next. So in June of 1907, if you know where Linwood crosses Washington, Adams, Jefferson, right there, just east of 80's Corner, that neighborhood was called Tuxedo Place, and it was an all-white area at the turn of the 20th century. On an afternoon in June of 1907, two black school teachers, it was announced in the newspaper that these two black school teachers had bought a house at 915 Linwood Avenue. The house is gone now. There's a next door was 913. It's kind of a concrete stone, has some archways in the front, and it's highly recognizable. But a gentleman named Henry Schrader, who's been justice of the peace and a powerhouse in the Republican Party, he wasn't after this, had sold the house next door to this black couple. And it was, there were almost riots in the street. The other homeowners along Linwood.
Just called Dave.
And they threatened their jobs. They went to the school board to try to get fired. And they were going to poison the well. The Schrader's son was beaten up in the middle of the street. He had to flee for his family's safety. And so there was for about a month, there was this horrible conflagration on it. But finally, the Davis street not buy the house. They gave Schrader his money back. And because they were threatening their lives, they were going to burn the house down. They said they'll wait for the life burnings. So all the people that lived there went to the developer, and they said, you made us build a 1,000 square foot house. You made us connect to the city sewer and the electricity. You made us do all these things to make this neighborhood nice. But here this, and they call it a Negro invasion. What are you going to do to stop this? So after 1909, in Evansville, Indiana, almost every house that was built east of Bedford Avenue and north of Washington Avenue contained a deed restriction. The house I grew up in on the side, if you looked at the abstract, it said, this property shall not be conveyed to anyone other than the Caucasian race. And that's how you build a ghetto legally without a zoning ordinance. Is you do it by deed restriction. That's why this is important, is because this triggered that deed restriction and basically redlining. What year was your house? It's 1954.
Mine is built in 46. That's in there.
I bet it is. So let's go to the next slide. So the effort, the search for justice for black people in Evansville was dicey. Black people couldn't serve on juries until late in the early 20th century. The only time a black person was chosen for a jury was if both plaintiff and defendant were black. But in February of 1913, there was a young man named Alan Von Baer who worked for his dad's lumber company, which was on North Oakley. Later it became part of International Harvester. But Mr. Von Baer, the old elder Von Baer, was chairman of the Business Association. And he was a very powerful man. But on a Saturday morning, and the Von Baer, which is ironic, the thread of irony is about this. The Von Baers were actually very liberal. There were about 25 black men that worked in the Von Baer plant. And it was hard for black people to get a good job. But on Saturday morning, Alan, who was 23 years old, he put on his jacket, left his off on the second floor, and walked down into the factory and started shooting black workers. He killed 3 black men before they could get a hold of him. And they took him to jail. And the reason this story is important, really, is because his dad was a friend of the judge, and the judge recused himself, and the new judge came in. The prosecutor was a friend of the dad, so another prosecutor came in, and they worked out a plea deal for manslaughter, one charge, and then they dropped the other 2. I guess the Von Baer family settled with the 3 families that had been killed. And he served about a year at the state farm. But the reason this is so important is because the very same week that he took his sentence for manslaughter, a black man got the same sentence for stealing therapy from the old lawsuit. He was nuts. Okay. So the school corporation, school board, over the years, the rules were that black school teachers had to sit in a separate place at all school teachers meetings, and there was a program of black children from all of over 4 black elementary schools in one black high school in 1918, and they all got together to do a choral program in April of 1918 at Central High School. But Frederick Douglass didn't have an auditorium, so they were using Central's auditorium for the program. The other was a rope that the black parents couldn't sit in the front. It was their show, all latched up. Right. The black parents couldn't sit there. So there was a teacher from the 3rd Avenue black school who protested to the principal at Central and said, "This is stupid. These are the parents of the children. Why can't they sit in the front?" And so there was like a 2-hour delay in the start of this program. It started like 9 o'clock that night. And one of the principals relented and took the rope down. And the black parents came down to sit in front of all the white parents got up and left, all the white parents got up and left. But the next day, the fellow who was head of the school board, he was also the editor of the Courier, his name was Howard Brewster. And Howard Brewster issued a statement from the school board saying that separation of races works best for everyone, and if the crime to cause the protest, he got suspended without pay for the rest of that school year. But the interesting thing about Howard Russo, later on, the school was built was named for him. And today it's the Joshua Academy that has almost 100% black student population. Let's go to the next slide. You can go on Oakland Cemetery
Yeah, that is
so
cool.
Indiana was a place northern and started something you don't know that. Hiram Evans, who was the Grand Dragon, was looking for a place to start a northern plan, and he chose Evansville, Indiana, because of a high population here of white men who were native born and who were descended from Western Europeans, Germans. And he thought this would be a good place to start the plan in 1920. So Joe Huffington came here in 1920, 1921. He recruited a fellow Tennessean named C. Stevens, and they both worked to establish the plan. And by 1925, the plan had spread to all the state of Indiana and actually controlled the Republican Party. And by 1925, more than 24% of the white population belonged to the plan. Now, the plan here, they would burn a cross in a black yard once in a while, but mainly they were Catholics. And one day, because prohibition was going on, and they were striving about prohibition, and they thought Catholics in power led to the consumption and sale of alcohol. So a lot of their efforts were against Catholics in Evansville, but there were some cross burns. It was if you know the story of ECC, of course, he raped and tortured a young lady on a train, and he was finally arrested and sent to prison. And then he named names of bride in the state of Indiana, brought down to the governor, lieutenant governor. Let's go to the next slide real quick. So in 1925, Evansville elected a Klan member as mayor. Herbert Mayles had been sheriff, and he ran for mayor when the Republican ticket under the KKK controlled the party. But he was elected mayor in a landslide because of the black vote, which was controlled by a guy named Ernest Tidrington, a black attorney here. They called him the boss of Athens town. Herbert Mayles did something that no other candidate would have promised to build a black high school. Remember the map we looked at? He promised to build a new black high school, and he was going to name it after Ernest Tidrington. And so Tidrington gave him 3,000 black votes. But I mean, immediately he was engulfed in scandal of the KKK because it was about that time that he was on trial. And Herb Mayles was one of the Republican politicians that took bribes. Herb Mayles was a terribly corrupt man. Let's go on to the next slide. We got to hurry up.
Almost 8. Yeah, it's 1 minute to late. Let's just wrap up soon.
The Boston Baptist Town, he was assassinated in January 1930, and it ended the old machine that the Republicans had established to control the black vote, which then really collapsed under FDR. But even you may not know this, but Oak Hill Cemetery is kind of a black section in those days. Of course, you know, until the Fair Housing Act, you could control their black property, and the cemetery was property. So there's a whole section of Oak Hill.
Yeah, let's wrap up soon.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so this is the old slum where blacks lived around the old now street. And it was a terrible health problem, the mortality rate was really high. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the second public housing project built in the state of Indiana for black people after Lockerbie Gardens in Indianapolis was Lincoln Gardens in Evansville, and it was remarkable because people from dirt floors and no plumbing into these beautiful apartments that had solid floors and indoor plumbing, kitchens, and central heat. And it was a miracle. Eleanor Roosevelt gave the dedication of Lincoln Gardens. The original building is one of the buildings is still there, so the African Museum. So let's go to the next slide real quick.
Do not delete stuff if you don't ask.
So during World War II, of course, you know, the war plants made lots and lots of things here for the war, but the local AFL refused to give blacks war plant jobs. The old mechanic arts school was segregated, and folks could go to high school there, black folks. So it wasn't until 1944 that black folks could go to the new tool and die shop and they go to Lincoln in 1944. So black people here were locked out of those good jobs. They weren't allowed to earn that money that the white people did during the war. So let's go on to the next slide.
Did that ever change though?
In the late. Right, but it costs more to build a city because you have all these white people riveted, and one would get sick, and so they bring in a black person to put on the line. The rest of them would get up and walk out, and so they would stay out until that black person was off the line, and they would come back. So there were a lot of delays. It cost a lot of money to build this city. So in 1950, we looked at that map. Let's go on. I'm trying to wrap up here.
Bad day.
Next slide, Jack.
My mom deleted stuff on my computer without
So,
asking me.
we talked about the here. So let's go on and skip that one. So this is important. In 1953, the federal government announced it was going to build 2 new developments, and Sweetser Homes was going to be reserved for white people only. And there were 2 black women that wanted to live there and filed suit against the housing authority. And one of their attorneys was Thurgood Marshall, and they argued in federal court in Indianapolis. And the judge, in an important ruling in July 7, 1953, Bill Steckler, ruled that racial restriction in public housing was violation of the 14th Amendment. So the lawsuit from here, there to end the segregation of public housing in the United States. There's no black for that. So let's go to the next slide. Public pools, public parks, tennis courts were all segregated until June 30th, 1996. The old Artie's pool on the north side, some black children wanted to register for swim lessons, and their parents took them. Artie's was reserved for white people only, threatened to sue. They were going to per black child that used entrance, and the city under Mayor Hardy, realizing that they won that suit, and they win, that it would bankrupt the city. So they ended public recreation in the end, segregation until June 30th, 1996, just 3 years before us. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, under art. So the 60s, there was a guy named George Chester in 1963 trying to buy a house in an all-white neighborhood on Kelsey Avenue. It was owned by the heirs of the state, and the trust department of Citizens National Bank had hired Huber Realty to sell the house. When the Chesters showed up, they had enough money to pay cash for the house, and the realtor called the trust department bank, and the trust department called the heirs, and they pulled the house off the market.
Wow.
So nothing had changed here in 56 years. But the only reason we know that is the only reason it became well known is because Mr. Chester's wife was the secretary of the Human Relations Commission, and they called the newspaper. So let's move on. So the next 1968 in August, it was during the Democrat National Convention. There were some boys in a pickup truck driving through the black neighborhood, firing arrows in the night as they walked the street. And I think that was the spark that caused the week of violence in the black neighborhood. I was 9, I kind of remember it because there were rumors that Black Panthers were on the way on buses. I'm like, it's rumors. So that was on Monday night. By Saturday night, it was a terrible thunderstorm, and that sort of quieted things. There was a police officer who was shot, but it was after this little orgy of violence that finally Frank McDonald, who was the mayor at the time, Bill Brooks, who was president of the city council, they decided to get serious about African American issues. And so by then they passed the Fair Housing Act, but there were a lot of private things going on, like the Chesters, that were going on behind the scenes. So they started arguing for an open housing bill locally. And in November of that year, the Open Housing Act was passed, and McDonald later, Russ Lloyd Sr., started appointing more black people to city boards and commissions. And it was after that that the federal government stepped in with the Equal Opportunity Employment Act. And so this is a pivotal moment there for Black SNP. So it was 1968. So there you have kind of a short story of the history of African Americans.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kelley. Wonderful.
I'd like to give you
Thank you. Thank you. 181 thoughts. Thank you, Kelley. Anybody have any short questions? I know we went well over 8. That's Jazz is the host. He can disable anyone. Okay. Cool.
Hey, I got something. When I was a kid, and I lived in Bicknell, Indiana, no black people were allowed to stay there after dark.
I got a package today that I've been waiting for several days.
Yeah, the Evansville's reputation was so bad that the riverboat captains, in order to keep order amongst the black people who worked on the riverboats and the barges and things, if they said when they were coming up to the town, they said, "Oh, don't pay it, we're going to put you off in Evansville."
Yeah.
But altered. In 2011, you know who Joseph Lowry was? He just died.
Yeah, with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Lowry,
Reverend,
here. When he was here for the Civil Rights dinner, he told the story, and I noticed I was like this, that the kid growing up in Huntsville, Alabama, and just at Christmas would take the train to the old rural Nashville, and they would ride to Chicago.
Sure.
And he said that all the black people that got on the train in Alabama had to sit in the front car because it was hot and smelled, and part of the luggage was there. It was rough, but that was the rule of the L&N Railroad.
Right.
You had to sit in the front car. And he said they all knew how many stops it was till you got to Evansville. And as soon as the train crossed the railroad bridge across the Ohio River, that rule ended. And the black people could move to whatever car they wanted to. And he said for him, his family, and people traveling north, Evansville was the place where you could relax and sit on the train bridge. So he said they never stopped here. He said that was his memory of
Yeah.
hearing about Evansville, because they would all pass the word, Evansville's the next stop, Evansville's the next stop, because that meant they could move around.
When I
That's
went to
fantastic.
Korea, there was another black fella named Horn, and they would call out Horn, and they both answer. and the sergeant would get mad or Nick, you know. I said, put her first names on there, okay? They
That'd
would-
be good. All right. Well, thank you to Kelley for your wonderful presentation. Thank you. Did you have anything you want to say?
This is a fantastic presentation. We had 4 hours. And I think you should consider getting bus in a tour.
That would be fantastic. Oh, would it?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
For being like guys,
Yeah, you. Thank you, Kelley.
No.